Thank you, Colin, for that introduction, and thanks to Invest Northern Ireland for inviting me here to speak today about what's driving innovation in packaging, obviously with a focus on sustainability. We're going to be looking at both market data, so at Mintel we measure innovation, we look at sort of new launches across the world, but also kind of the mindset of the consumer, because we ask consumer questions. So that's what we'll be looking at today. Before I jump into some data, just like to first highlight the good relationship we have with Invest Northern Ireland, and we have reports that are available to members, so do reach out if you want to access any of those and see how Mintel can perhaps help you in your innovation funnel or your strategy going forward. So back to sustainability. The first thing I wanted to do is get a feel for how important sustainable packaging is in terms of what brands are doing, what brands are sort of putting out there in the world. And I've got some global data here. This is launches over the past year by the top 5 claims. So if we look at that section for Europe, it says that 24%, that highlights that 24%, almost a quarter of launches in Europe made a eco-friendly packaging claim in the past year. And we can see that actually for Europe, that's the most important claim. It's by far the most important claim, far above sort of no additives, no or low reduced allergens, social media gluten-free. So clearly within the European region, brands have recognized the importance of eco-friendly packaging as standing out, differentiating, but also delivering to consumers' needs. We see a similar sort of pattern in other markets across the world. We see the relative importance of eco-friendly packaging. In some, it's not the most important, but what we have seen is over the past 5 years, year on year, every year, a significant increase in the percentage of launches making these kind of eco-friendly claims, highlighting how brands are increasingly seeing that packaging attribute as a way of enhancing the kind of product claims that they're using to sell their products. And one of the things that obviously has really driven that over the past couple of years has been concern over plastic pollution. And that has really kind of created an environment where we've seen a lot of novel materials being used. And one of those novel materials is traditional material, paper and board, but used in novel ways. So we're seeing in yogurts, for example, launches like this Yomo yogurt in Italy, which is a board tub, entirely recyclable, using a recyclable foil film closure. Interestingly, what it does is it uses it's a entirely printed surface, but it obviously prints to reflect that sort of fiber-based nature of the packaging. We can see Vaso and Carter, the branding there is all about the packaging, so clearly that packaging material attribute is a really big sales point for this particular product. We can see also paper being used in pack formats where it hadn't traditionally been used, such as pouches. Good example there in the middle of a paper-based pouch. We've seen that now in a lot of dry products like cereals, for example, and in dried pasta. This is a snack. We can see that on the front of the pack it says working towards plastic-free, clearly making that a front of pack, a shopper sort of facing communication. We're also seeing some really interesting novel introductions like the paper bottle from Pulpex, now put in partnership with Stora Enso, a 100% paper bottle that tries to overcome the issues with moisture barrier and the need for plastic in that. So we're seeing these interesting innovations. But what's interesting is how does that sort of play out in sort of a grand scale in terms of what consumers see on the shelf? And I tried to sort of get some data that highlights that, and that's what we're looking at in this slide. This is looking at, again, launch data, as we were looking at before, and the percentage of launches that are packaged in primary plastic packaging. And we can see for food, for the past 6 years, there's been a minor change from about 72% of launches to 69% of launches using a primary plastic pack, whether that be a plastic pouch or plastic tray or whatever. So really haven't seen any kind of change. It can happen. We've seen in bottled water, it's a category where we've seen a really strong focus of concern around plastic, in particular PET use. And we see that actually there has been a dip from about 84% of launches to 72. So in that particular category, the launches of cartons, for example, launches of metal cans, often making very clear on-pack claims around plastic free, or even branding around the focus on removing plastic, has had a big impact on what consumers are seeing on shelf and the availability of alternative materials. But actually in food, it hasn't happened so far. We're still seeing, when we go down that food aisle, the vast majority of products are still packaged in the same packaging they always have been, which is majority plastic. So how brands are actually sort of dealing with that? How are they kind of saying, well, we need plastic for all the benefit that it brings, but we're also responding to your consumer requirement that we reduce our plastic footprint? Well, there's a number of ways we can do that. One of the biggest ways we've seen is a move to plastic that makes a reduced plastic claim. We've seen sort of some plastic free, but as we saw with those paper-based launches, those plastic-free claims tend to be quite niche. They tend to be emerging brands. They tend to be ones that focus very strongly as a complete sort of brand positioning around environment. When it comes to some of the bigger brands, those for whom it's less the main driver, we're seeing a move towards responsible plastic use. And responsible plastic use is essentially telling the consumer we're only using the plastic we need to deliver on our promises of, you know, long shelf life, of preserving the product quality, and also increasingly because of COVID-19 in terms of that hygienic barrier between the product and potential contamination in the environment. We know, for example, that shoppers are reporting to us concern around who's touched the product packaging before they reach it in store. We're seeing concern around, you know, contamination of food and drink with coronavirus, meaning consumers are moving away from unpackaged to packaged goods. And therefore we're seeing a reappraisal of plastic in the light of consumer concern in terms of a material that provides that reassuring physical and hermetic barrier between the product and the consumer until they get it home. And so for all these reasons, we're seeing plastic moving from something that consumers are wanting to eliminate completely to something they're wanting to see used responsibly. And across all different pack types, like on the left here, we're seeing a tube making a claim around 17% less plastic, simply being lightweighted. Again, in the middle, 15% less plastic. For rigid trays, we can see on the right-hand side there, some quite significant claims of lightweighting here, 50% less plastic. And again, it's a number that consumers can understand. 50% less plastic, this is half the plastic that I was using before. I'm reducing my plastic footprint, and I know that the brand is obviously working to use as little plastic as possible, so that's a responsible amount. So that's important, and that really aligns with what consumers are telling us. Here we're looking at consumer data. I've chosen sort of some random countries to give us a global feel, so Ireland, South Africa, and the US, and we can see that in each country, the thing that consumers think brands should do to make packaging most environmentally friendly is reduce the amount of plastic packaging they use. On the left-hand side there, that's the one that most consumers tend to agree is important. We see further down, reduce the amount of packaging. So we still have this perception of over packaging. So where we can reduce packaging, where we can make sure that we're not having things that are seen as excess, that's really important. The other thing, though, is recyclability. We can see there the second most important, use packaging that can be recycled. Fourth most important, make it easier to recycle packaging. So that might be in terms of simplifying the pack, or simply providing the information that consumers need to recycle in a way that they feel that they're doing it correctly, that they're obviously not putting things into the recycle bin that are not supposed to be there. Some of the more unusual claims, such as refillable, using recycled material, further down that's knowledge and relevance to those consumers. But I think those are going to grow as we see some of these more niche solutions being positioned in front of consumers, and they see them more often and understand the potential benefits from those. But clearly right now, on the mind of consumer, is reducing material, making it recyclable. And because of that, we're seeing brands responding to make their packaging more recyclable. And in particular, that is a huge thing in food when it comes to flexibles, because that is a pack format. Plastic flexibles are difficult to recycle, and in many cases they're multi-laminate, which makes them even more difficult to recycle. So seeing brands moving from multi-laminates to monomaterial. So we see that even in packed formats that you might have already expected to be recyclable and monomaterials, such as Heinz squeezable PET bottle across Europe, they're now taking out laminate structures within that to make that a monomaterial recyclable PET bottle. We're also seeing it particularly in flexible pouches, what we've seen over the past sort of 10 years is some really strong technical developments in multi-laminates that give us some amazingly positive properties. But unfortunately, those multi-laminates are difficult to recycle. So now we're seeing material providers working with brands to regain and retain some of those material properties, but within a monolaminate. And here, for example, Gerber in the US have moved from a multi-laminate to a single material polypropylene pouch. Similarly, Bear Naked have moved to a mono-material, well, it's actually a multi-laminate, but of different grades of polyethylene, which means that that could be recycled through the in-store bag recycling scheme. In both cases, we can see that the brands are recognizing it's not always easy to recycle. Pouch designed for the future of recycling in the middle there, recycle ready. Not all consumers have access to recycling, particularly curbside recycling for flexibles. So we have to be honest about the journey we're taking towards a future where that is possible for consumers. Going forward, what we're seeing is obviously that recycling is a first step in a closed loop system, including recycled content is growing in importance. And we're seeing food really kind of having to catch up to some extent towards drink, personal care, household really kind of at the front of using recycled material, because obviously lower concerns around food contact, but also perhaps lower quality requirements have enabled that. But increasingly, consumers are going to be seeing these kind of activities in household in terms of use of recycled content and questioning why they're not seeing that in food. We are starting to see the emergence of recycled content, in some cases even 100% recycled plastic in this Hellmann's mayonnaise in Canada, for example. We're seeing interesting use of language on pack. So this example in the middle there, Harmony, that plastic tray describes as being made with plastic equivalent to a 600 milliliter water bottle. So it's not just saying recycled plastic, it's making that relevant to consumers. On the right-hand side there, it's talking about post-consumer recycled waste, not just simply recycled plastic, making obviously relevant to consumer recycling actions. But the other thing, and what I want to finish on, is that whilst we've seen a very strong focus on what I call the materiality of the pack, what is the pack made of? Is it plastic? Is it paper? What does that mean in terms of can I recycle it? But increasingly, consumers are looking beyond that for how is that packaging relevant to the impact that product and packaging has overall. And one of the drivers for that is climate change and that increasing importance of climate change and relevance, and the fact that we're seeing things like the wildfires in North America and in Australia last year really kind of bringing climate change to the fore. We're also seeing here for about 58% of Irish consumers think climate change will have an effect on the food and drink that they buy. So we're not just seeing consumers thinking, oh yes, climate change is bad for the environment. It's bad in terms of actually it's changing what I have access to, and we're starting to see concern around things like access to food, to water and other resources, really driving up consumer agenda. And as a result, we're seeing obviously that playing through on pack, things like use of plant-based materials being linked to 18% less carbon emissions compared to a standard pack. That's a claim there on the left-hand side. The claim in the middle there is around the use of recycled plastic enabling a carbon reduction. So again, what we're seeing is various responsible packaging actions like using recycled material being framed around what the impact that has on reduction of carbon. We're also seeing obviously packaging being important in terms of the fascia that we use to discuss carbon footprint in the product. And a good example of that is Oatly, where we can see on the front of the pack it says climate footprint 0.29 kilograms of carbon emissions per kilogram of product. But it doesn't just give a number. Consumers like numbers, they're easy to understand in terms of compare and contrast one number to another, but sometimes in isolation they're not so easy to understand. So here devotes an entire side panel of the packaging to, hey industry, show us your food numbers. It's discussing what that number means, discussing how the brand is working to keep that number low. It's providing a number, then putting it in context, and that is increasingly important. And then beyond that, I think we're going to see a growth in discussing how packaging can help prevent the poor use of resources beyond simply, again, the material in the pack. So on the left-hand side, energy, we're seeing here claims around packaging made with renewable energy. The example in the middle there, water. So we're seeing a pack made from both carton and grass, which enables the brand to make a reduced water use claim. And the final example, which I think is really interesting, it's a compostable pack, but it talks about how that compost has a positive benefit in terms of fertilizing soil. And soil health and soil fertility is something we're going to see increasingly go up the agenda as consumers start to become concerned about food access with the way that we're depleting soil energy across the world. So finally, just to quickly summarize, okay, plastic reduction, as important as plastic elimination, we're not really seeing in food a massive switch away from plastic. What we're seeing is brands committing to responsible use of plastic. And that means in many cases using less, but also using recyclable. And here we see bringing recyclability to flexible is obviously the big next barrier for food, and where we're seeing a lot of activity. And going forward beyond that materiality, it's about carbon and carbon measures and how packaging can both reduce those measures, but also increasingly be the way that consumers compare and contrast when it comes to carbon measures for products. So with that, I'll thank you for your time, and I look forward to speaking with you in our forthcoming Q&A session. Thank you.